Welcome to the Northern Alliance Emerging Literacy Buddy Network resource video. This video is designed to be used as part of the Buddy Networks in November 2017 across the Northern Alliance. This resource video includes the content for the November Buddy Networks, supporting the ongoing collaboration across the Northern Alliance. As shared at our previous networks in September, the aims of the Emerging Literacy Networks are twofold. Firstly, we aim to support you in taking a developmental approach to emerging literacy through sharing theory, assessments, support materials, and various rollout models in taking a developmental approach to emerging literacy. The second aim, the core ethos to the work across the Northern Alliance, is to build collaborative working partnerships with colleagues within and across settings. The Buddy Networks aim to strengthen these collaborations within smaller groups within local authorities and health boards. Even though I'm not there with you today with my numbered cards, my coloured cards, or my jigsaw cards, the first task is going to require you to work with colleagues across different establishments. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to get yourselves rearranged across the room and try and work with a variety of different people in smaller groups of, say, 4 or 5. Within each of your groups, you want to have a mixture of teachers, of senior managers, and if you've got partners there today, such as allied health professionals or educational psychologists, a mixture of those across the groups also. Whilst you organise yourself into your new group, please pause the video. Now that you've organised yourselves into your new group, your first task is, of course, a voice on the table. Before you do your voice on the table, you're going to have to work out who's travelled the furthest distance this year, and then, after that, move clockwise and share your name, your place of work and your role, and your dream destination. You should allow up to 5 minutes to complete this task, and whilst you do so, please pause the video. There are 3 aims which we hope to explore through today's Buddy Network across the Northern Alliance. The first is what we're going to be hoping to do is try and unpick and define what it means to take a whole school approach to emerging literacy. The second is to provide some space in terms of collaboration to allow you to share your own school's progress in taking a developmental approach to emerging literacy, sharing both your successes and your next steps. And also, thirdly, what we're hoping to do is look at some of the similarities across your buddy network in terms of both your strengths and your next steps, and areas which you can continue to work on together during the course of the academic session. On the screen at the moment, you can see the session agenda with some approximate timings for this network session today. Each of the parts of the network have been split up through this resource video, and the suggested timings correlate with that on each of the slides. You may find it useful during the discussion sessions to use a stopwatch or the online timer tool to try and gauge your time during each of the activities to make sure you can get the most out of this buddy network today. The first task of today's session is going to be looking at sharing some of the progress which you've been making over the course of this academic session if you're a year 1, and if you're a year 2, reflecting on both your progress from last year and the progress that you've been making this year so far. For this task, what you're going to need is this year's data in terms of the trackers which you've collected, and also the action plan which we put out from the last session when we met together during September. You will be looking at the sharing progress section for the next 15 to 20 minutes within your smaller groups which you've organised yourself into. Within your smaller groups, each of the teachers within the group are going to be sharing the progress which the children have been making. Starting with the teacher who's wearing the brightest top at your group and moving clockwise, you should share your data from your initial assessments in terms of that tracking information for your class. Share your action plan that you created following the first network back in September. share the progress that children have made since in the initial assessments back in August and September to now, and talk about the next steps which your class are working on currently. You'll recall from the previous networks in September that we suggest that the trackers are used as an ongoing tool to inform your learning and teaching. Once identifying the strengths and gaps through the assessment and screening process, we suggested using the action plan to identify the next steps for the children within your class. You will have been using these next steps to plan your learning and teaching accordingly. We suggest that assessment and tracking of these foundational literacy skills is ongoing. When you feel a child is secure in a certain area after a block of learning and teaching, you can use the screening resources to identify whether a child is now secure within that area, marking it off on the tracker as you go. This enables you to monitor the progress that children are making and plan your learning and teaching appropriately. You should now pause the video for the next 15 to 20 minutes whilst you take part in this discussion task. You may wish to set a timer for 15 minutes. The next section is going to start unpicking how to take a whole school approach to emerging literacy to have the greatest impact on your school community. So firstly, let's reflect on the question what literacy is really for. Back in Building the Curriculum 1 in 2006, they referred to literacy being the passport to learning, equipping young people with the relevant skills for learning, life and work. In our daily lives, we can think about lots of ways in which we use literacy. We think about our literacy skills for pleasure, for the information that we might need, being able to get from A to B, for example. Thinking about how we communicate with or influence others. Thinking about how we can defend ourselves in certain situations. Our access to healthcare, being able to get money, and being able to move around. And the list really does go on. And what's important to recognise with the children and young people we work with is around about understanding the variance, something we've discussed previously. And when we think about the variance, we think about those two variable factors. We think about the different experiences which our children and young people may have had, thinking about the different opportunities which they've had. We think about how we can address some of those experience gaps when we're thinking about closing the gap and our link with People Equity Fund. We also have to think about the natural variation of each of our children and young people, thinking that we need to be aware of that variation and our learning and teaching needs to be adapted to those needs. So emerging literacy was born on the premise of these two literacy puzzles which are in front of you. The first puzzle is a child who, despite all of that evidence-based instruction in Primary 1, doesn't make the expected progress by the end of Primary 1. The other is the child who perhaps makes reasonable progress in Primary 1, but somewhere later on in school experiences that dip that we're recognising in the middle of primary school. And then when we think about those children, in perhaps Primary 5, for example, firstly, that child who didn't make the age and stage expected progress by the end of Primary 1, and that child who perhaps did, but the gaps are starting to show later in primary school. What have those two children got in common? We need to think about those gaps in their foundational literacy skills. We need to think about it in terms of early literacy issues. They can't make the most of the instruction which they've been given. And for later issues, they've got insufficiently secure foundations, and the demands, when they increase, can leave children feeling overwhelmed. So let's see if we can simulate an experience. This isn't going to be too dissimilar to the initial training event for emerging literacy. However, I promise there will be no simple sentences for you to write today. You will need something to write on and something to write with. I'll just give you a moment to get yourself organised. Okay, so what I would like you to do today is, I would just like you to write one word. And the word I would like you to write is bat. Bat. The word I would like you to write is bat. Okay, within your groups, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to discuss and share some of the things around about that task. I'd like you to think about the prior knowledge you needed in order to do that successfully. I want you to think about any particular skills that you needed in order to be able to do that. And also I wanted you to think about how much information did you need to keep in your head at once when you were doing that task. You should now pause the video for around about 5 minutes. Within this time, you should discuss that as a group and share any commonalities across the network. Some of the things that you may have shared in terms of being prepared for the task may have been some of the aspects such as the motivation and willingness to take part in the task, having the materials in order to be ready for that, thinking about the understanding and comprehension of what the task was asking you to do, and in particular, understanding the language of the task. You may have talked about the listening and attention skills which were required, the auditory memory skills which were needed to hold and recall that string of information. You may have talked about the need to decipher between what the task was and the instructions themselves. You may have thought about the word boundaries which were needed in being able to decipher that single word which you were asked to write down, bat. But once you had those skills themselves, let's see what process we may have needed to go through in terms of being able to write that word. Well, you may have taken that word bat and started to think about that first sound. You might have started to think about that b, b, b at the beginning of bat. And in order to be able to write that successfully, you need to have those skills to be able to segment the word bat into the sounds b, a, t. And when we're starting to identify that first sound, b, you need to have a clear representation of what that b sounds like and a correlation of what that looks like in terms of your phoneme-grapheme correspondence. But what if you do have fuzzy phoneme representation? What if you're not sure how that b sound is represented? Well, you may be able to say the word bat, but you may not have a clear representation of the individual sounds within that word, and you may not have the correlating phoneme-grapheme correspondence between each of the sounds and the letters which represent them. So when you went about writing that word, you identified that initial sound and you were able to link that to its letter shape, realising that that b sound is represented by the letter B. Then what you needed to do was have the movements assembled in order to be able to write that letter. You needed to understand the shapes, the way those shapes are manipulated, the understanding of directionality in order to create those shapes, and the order in which those different moves are assembled. Next, you need to think about the grip and the grasp which is required in order for you to be able to hold and control the writing implement, thinking about the different pressure which may be required in terms of the mark making. Then featuring into taking that b sound and producing a written shape that looks like that picture within your head in terms of that shape manipulation. And for you as adults to do that seamlessly, that needs to be automatic, it needs to be consolidated, something which we've practiced over a number of years and something which is now an automatic skill for us. We're familiar with these aspects which are on the screen. We've talked before around about the concepts of print, the phonological awareness, the oral language, and the pre-handwriting skills which are required in order to be able to do that task successfully. We've also got to be mindful of the working memory capacity and executive function skills which are needed in order to be able to do that task. Working memory and executive function are an overarching set of skills which we're going to explore through the local networks during the course of this academic session, linked to the other 4 key skill areas. Emerging literacy aims to develop collaboration within and across local authorities and within and across health boards to improve the outcomes for children and young people. This slide looks at, prior to emerging literacy, how some of the interactions in early literacy took place. We had teachers that were clear in terms of how to teach, and they knew that their teaching and learning worked for some, sometimes most of the people, but didn't work for everyone. And we knew that allied health professionals, educational psychologists, had that developmental knowledge on foundational skills. And in our schools which have made the most amount of progress which we've worked with across the Northern Alliance, they really have started to look at embedding a whole school approach to emerging literacy, thinking how this looks in early learning and childcare, thinking about how this in primary 1 can prevent the preventable literacy difficulties, matching the teaching and learning to the natural variation and the different experiences which children have had, supported through their differentiation, and also thinking about how this can be used as a more targeted approach beyond primary 1 to address gaps in children's foundational skills and aim to prevent and support persistent literacy difficulties in line with other targeted interventions. Through our collaboration within and across local authorities and within and across health boards, we know that the landscape has changed and is continuing to change. Much of the traditional specialist knowledge, which was traditionally used remedially by specialist services, is now being brought into classrooms and early years environments, used preventatively to support the learning and teaching of children and young people. We still have a narrative in which teachers say they know how to teach, but they now know why they're doing the things they do and how to do them in a way in which supports each and every child. We also have partners within allied health professions and educational psychology that know what the teachers want from them, and that partnership is something we want to continue to grow and foster as we collaborate across the Northern Alliance. For the next section of this network, you are going to be organising yourselves back into your individual school groups, so working with those from the same school as you. Partners in the likes of allied health professions and educational psychology can organise themselves across school groups during the course of the next task. You should now briefly pause the video whilst you reorganise yourselves. For this task, you will now need your copy of the Whole School Emerging Literacy Audit Tool, which was provided alongside the materials prior to this network. The audit tool has been created to support schools in taking a whole school approach to emerging literacy, looking at what that looks like in early learning and childcare, in primary 1, and beyond primary 1. The cover page of the audit tool provides overarching statements which demonstrate how emerging literacy is being developed across the Northern Alliance within early learning and childcare, within primary 1, and beyond primary 1. If you now move on to page 1, you will see the overall audit for taking a developmental approach to emerging literacy, linked to the 5 quality indicators from how good is our school for and how good is our early learning and childcare, which feature within the Emerging Literacy Improvement Plan. To the right of each of the quality indicators, you will find a list of statements which demonstrate how schools can take a whole school approach to emerging literacy, linked to each of the QIs in Higios 4 and Higio-ELK. Your first task within your school group is to reflect on your own journey with emerging literacy as a school and look at completing page 1 of the audit process. You may wish to use ticks to identify aspects which you've developed, or use a code such as red, amber and green to demonstrate your progress within each of these individual statements. When you're having your discussions around about page 1, you also want to think about and record the evidence which you have for each of the points within the audit tool. Within your individual school group, you should now spend the next 10 to 15 minutes using page 1 of the audit tool to audit your progress as a school. You should now pause the video. Once you've completed the initial flash audit using page 1 of the audit tool, pages 2 to 6 include a page for each of the quality indicators mentioned on page 1 for you to identify areas of next steps which you are going to develop. Pages 2 to 6 should be used to identify your next steps and agree actions to support ongoing self-evaluation within the school improvement planning process. Over the next 10 minutes, you should identify the areas from page 1 which you are still to work on as a school. Using the relevant sections within pages 2 to 6, you should agree on actions which you are going to take forward as a school following today's network. It is useful to note at this time that the audit process is ongoing. Each school will have different areas which they will be working on, and you may find some similarities across the different schools within the network. Whilst there may be some areas which you have identified as strengths currently, ongoing self-evaluation may identify that you need to work on this area in the future. We therefore recommend that this audit is used as part of your ongoing self-evaluation and will feature in the rest of the networks for this academic session. You now have 10 minutes as a school to agree on your action plan moving forward. You should now pause the video. Over the next 10 minutes, each school should have the opportunity to share their key next steps from the audit tool and reflect on their actions moving forward as a school. Within the network, you should identify any commonalities which you may be able to work on collaboratively and any further input which may be required. Please pause the video to allow you to complete this task for the next 10 minutes. At our previous networks in September, we started to look at the Northern Alliance Principles of Effective Phonics Teaching and Correlating Audit Tool. The next task is going to give you some time as a school to reflect on where your progress is in terms of the Principles of Effective Phonics Instruction, thinking about those 3 questions. The first thing I'd like you to discuss as a school are the strengths that the school have in terms of effective phonics instruction. The second is around about the school's next steps, which may have changed since the first network in September. The third is around about any support which you feel you need in terms of achieving those next steps. You have 10 minutes as individual school groups. You should now pause the video. Before we move into the next task, I'd like you to go back to the number groups which you organised yourselves into previously, with a variety of people across different schools and support services. Please pause the video briefly whilst you reorganise yourselves. Your smaller group is now going to have 10 minutes to share the discussion from the last task. Within this task, you should think about the Buddy Network's strengths within phonics, the Buddy Network's next steps within effective phonics instruction. You should reflect on any things which you can share across the network and any further support which you would require to do that. This task allows for around about 10 minutes for this discussion. You should now pause the video. As the Northern Alliance as a regional improvement collaborative continues to grow and develop, we are beginning to explore different ways of supporting collaboration. Within the Northern Alliance Raising Attainment in Literacy, Language and Communication workstream, we have face-to-face collaboration through Northern Alliance events and local authority networking events. Following feedback, this year we are also going to be exploring online collaboration through Yammer. Prior to this network, you all received the Northern Alliance Raising Attainment in Literacy, Language and Communication Yammer guidance notes. The guidance explains on how you can access and contribute to the Yammer page for Raising Attainment in Literacy, Language and Communication. The Yammer site is going to be used to promote and support ongoing collaboration in between local networks and regional events. The Yammer site is a platform within Glow which can be accessed via the Glow Launchpad. You should, if you've not done so already, use the instructions to access the Raising Attainment in Language, Literacy and Communication Yammer site for the Northern Alliance. We aim to use this platform across the Northern Alliance to strengthen the collaboration between practitioners, to share resources, to be able to give a space to share impact on practice and outcomes for children, and be able to discuss queries and questions which we may have. The guidance document refers to the Northern Alliance contact database which has been set up and is accessed through the Yammer site. Following feedback, it was agreed that a contact database with all of the practitioners involved in taking a developmental approach to emerging literacy across the Northern Alliance would be created to support individual and small group collaboration. If you've not done so already, you should check whether your details are within and are correct on the database. In addition to this, if you are a teacher, you should identify which class you teach, how many children are in that class per stage, and whether you teach within English medium or Gaelic medium. The first task is a reflection task which should firstly be done individually. I'd like you to reflect on the learning from today's network and previous networks and write down something which you'd like to know more about when taking a developmental approach to emerging literacy. You should now pause the video for 1 minute to allow participants to write their reflections. Within your small group, you should now share the thing which you would like to know more about. This will be something which you will share on the Yammer site following today's session. Please pause the video for around 3 or 4 minutes to allow everyone to share. Following tonight's network, there are 3 next steps. The first one is if you've not done so already, you should access the Yammer site and check that your details are on the database. The second is following tonight's network, you should access the Yammer site and share the thing that you would like to find out more about. Have a read of the other posts too. There may be something which you can contribute to from your own experience or something which you're also interested in the thread. The third part is bring back your whole school audit and your data to the next session in January to share your ongoing progress. I hope you enjoyed tonight's network and I look forward to seeing you in January.